Hello, and welcome once again to Family Historian. My name is Stephen Conte. Tonight, Family Historian is going back to church, and tonight we are going to learn about the records of the Methodist Church. And joining me on tonight's show, I am very honored to have as my guest a young man named Mathew Enzler. Pastor Matt is currently the minister at the Bishop Janes Methodist Church in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. He is also an attorney, and so he knows a lot about record keeping. And on tonight's show, Pastor Matt is going to teach us how we can find our Methodist roots. And now let's welcome Pastor Matt.
Thank you, Stephen. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Great. Now, before we get into the how-to of finding our Methodist roots, let's go way back in time, Matt. And I know we have to talk about two English brothers in the early 1700s. And who were these men?
There were two brothers, John and Charles Wesley, and they were the children of Samuel Wesley. He was an Anglican priest, and so they were raised around the church. But as they grew up, they took on religion to their own to become ministers themselves in various ways. They went to Oxford College at Christ Church and began really one of the early college ministries of the time, and what became known as the Holy Club, a very methodical approach to growing one's faith. John Wesley, the founder of what we call the Methodist tradition, really honed in on these practices, while his brother wrote just thousands and thousands of poems and songs that were used to help spread the theology of the Methodist movement.
Right. Now, hence the word Methodist, Methodism. You mentioned methodical. And who gave them this kind of nickname, which they wore as a badge of courage, I think?
Yeah, they absolutely did. It was not self-chosen. Because of the practices of this college ministry group, this Holy Club that they had, which laid out practices throughout the day and even over a course of weeks, how to grow your faith, people said, well, that's very methodical. And then the name was ascribed to them by other people at Christ Church. They were known as the Methodists. And at first it didn't stick, but eventually they just accepted it and wore it as a badge of honor.
Right. Now, when did John and Charles find fault with the Anglican Church? When did this split, or not split, but they questioned the Church of England at that time?
Yeah, so once they began their actual ministry after college, what they saw was that the church wasn't available to the common person. There was a practice in the Anglican Church, which we today would call a pew tax. So you'd have to pay in order to have a pew, and it was designated as your pew and would often have a little emblem with your family name on it. If you couldn't afford that, you'd either have to sit in the back or stand, and often up in the balcony, a standing only area. It just wasn't very comfortable for the long services that are in the Anglican tradition. So the church itself it wasn't available to the common person.
Right, so this church really appealed to the working man and woman.
Absolutely, yes.
To bring them the gospel.
Yeah, it was his primary focus to bring his gospel, Jesus' gospel, to the world. So he would go out to mines, to factories, wherever the common working person was, and even preach outdoors on rocks or on a stool, however he could reach the people.
Right, and this is a man who came from, did he come from a wealthy family?
They certainly weren't poor. Being a rector in the Anglican tradition, they were well provided for. He had a large family.
Right, because we do have a picture of the rectory where they were raised in Epworth, England, I believe.
That's correct.
Right.
Yes.
Now, when did he start preaching? He wasn't allowed to preach inside the Anglican Church at one time, so he would go outside the church and gather the people around him.
Yeah, it was a funny story. He was so popular, but also just a little bit too diverse for the Anglican priests. They wouldn't allow him to preach from the pulpit. So when he would go from town to town, he would just stand outside and share his message outdoors because he wasn't allowed indoors.
Right, and we do have another picture of a foundry where he would preach.
Yeah, the foundry was a major step for him. That was his first indoor church that he himself built, taking what was a cannon factory for the English government that had closed down some years before, and he refurbished it to his first church that seated over 1,000 people.
Really, isn't that something? And this goes back, I know you have a tradition in your faith, the circuit rider, where the minister would travel from town to town. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, both John as well as the rest of his brothers, and I say brothers, his ministry brothers,
Right.
would travel around from church, to region, just bringing the gospel directly to the people.
Yeah. Now, I never knew this, but the Wesley brothers did set foot in America in the 1730s, I believe. And tell our viewers about that. What happened with that?
Sure. So in the late 1730s, they traveled to what was called the Oglethorpe Colony, and that was a military establishment. Their hope was twofold. One, to bring the gospel in their methodical ways to the New World, the Native Americans of the region,
Right.
but also to the settlers, the people that were coming across from all over the place, just to set up their methodical approach to faith.
And this is, the Oglethorpe colony is present day?
Savannah, Georgia.
I see, okay. So, and how long did they stay on our shores here?
Just a few years. I'd say less than 5 years. It proved to be very unsuccessful. And John just came back home after about 4 or 5 years due to some controversy that happened.
Right. But Methodism really grew in this country, would you say?
Yeah, that was about 30 years later. John had sent over other missionaries to really spread this method.
Right. And who was Francis Asbury? That's a very popular name in Methodism.
Huge name, huge name.
Yeah.
Francis Asbury was one of the first, if not the first, bishop in the United Methodist Church, or at that time the Methodist Church, or Methodist tradition of the Anglican Church. And he was made a bishop under emergency protocol by John Wesley. It was a big scandal in the church because John didn't really have permission to do that, but he felt it so important to have leadership in the church in the Americas, he made Francis a bishop.
Right. So it really began with this triumvirate, John, Charles, and Francis Asbury.
Yes, yes.
And I know there's a wonderful picture of the three of them in a stained glass window. And you've seen that.
I have. Beautiful picture.
Yes. So those are the three founders of Methodism, you would say.
As we know it today, yes.
As you know it today. Okay. Now, the circuit rider, well, Asbury was a circuit rider.
Oh, yeah. He traveled across a vast territory, being the bishop for most of the Americas as the Methodist tradition spread throughout the colonies.
Right. Okay, now let's get into the how. We gave you the history of Methodism in about 3 minutes there. Let's get to the how-to. Where would the researcher begin? Would they begin on the local level, going right to the individual church?
They would, and various local churches have varying degrees of records. It wasn't really a priority of the church in the early tradition, but as time went on, we saw the importance of creating records. So that's definitely a place to begin, and that's where you're going to find records of the individual members.
Right. Now, in your church, you are not necessarily the record keeper. Do you have people in your church who are the record keepers?
Yes, and most Methodist churches do have an appointed or an elected person, actually, by the church council that is strictly responsible for that task.
Unless it's a small country church, then the minister himself or herself would be the record keeper?
That's correct, yes.
I see. Now, we do have some original Methodist church records that we'll show you right now, and Pastor Enzler will read them to you. We'll start with a birth record that you have here. This is from a church that no longer exists. It's the Clinton Methodist Church, which was in Fairfield, New Jersey, which is my hometown. And can you give us a few entries there? Now, you have infant baptism as well as adult baptism.
Yes,
I see.
Both.
If you can select one entry there.
Sure. So according to this record, in 1879, on the January 1st, LaPorte Bush was an infant that was baptized to the parents of Cornelius and Sarah E. Bush.
Okay. And then you have some adult, I think there are some adult baptisms on there.
Yes, in 1880, on January 25th, John Ward was baptized on his own accord.
Right. And these are in, you have the book of baptism, book of marriages. Is that how the records are kept?
Yes, in most churches, we'll have various types of books. Some are annual books that have just that individual years.
Right.
And other churches have a master book, which is a huge, very heavy book that contains various sections.
Right.
And has each section tabbed for what's in it.
I must say, you use the word methodical. However, the Methodists are not the most methodical record keepers. Do you agree with me on that?
Definitely for the early church.
In the early church.
Yes.
Right, right.
It was not our priority. Our priority was spreading the gospel and being missionaries to the world. So our record keeping, especially with the fact that the pastors themselves and the priests were itinerant, meaning they rode horses and traveled all across the land, would have been very difficult for them to maintain proper records.
Right. And you told me even today's Methodist ministers move around a lot.
We do. It's the system we call itinerancy, and I go where the bishop sends me. All pastors are subject to appointment by the bishop.
And you have a bishop who is your supervisor or your boss.
Exactly, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. Now let's look at the marriage record from the same church. And Pastor Matt will read this to us.
Okay. So here we have a record in 1877 that on February 1st, John Westervelt married Emma A. Clark. John was 24 at the time. She was 18. And he lived in Caldwell. She also lived in Caldwell, so it has both of their residences where they came from. And the wedding was officiated by Reverend Van Sant. And there's a witness recorded here, which appears to be the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Van Sant, and it says their children were also present.
Right. Could you read us one more, Matt, there?
Sure. So in 1878, on December 29th, Gilbert Van Nepp married Mary Price. He was 24, she was 22 at the time. He was from Farmersville. She was from Fairfield, not too far from here right now. And this was also presided over by Reverend Van Sant and was witnessed by the parents of both parties.
Very good. Okay. Now we have a record here that is very unique in Methodism, in the Methodist Church, and Pastor Matt Enzler will tell us the name of this record and why it's so important in Methodism. This is where they really get methodical.
Yeah, so by the early 20th century, a lot of rules were in place about membership requirements. And so this is a record from, looks to be 1925 through about 1926, would have been the monthly meeting when the minister was present. So the minister is not always present every week. They would have had lay ministers.
Right.
But this would have been the monthly meeting of when the minister was actually present.
And this record is called a...
It's an attendance record of the membership.
I say roll of attendance.
Yes, record and roll of attendance.
Okay.
And so what we have here is various members of the church at that time and a record of their attendance on those very important Sundays. So if you look down here in the middle, we have somebody with very good attendance. Mabel Clark has almost perfect attendance. You see that she was present on April 6th, May the 4th, June 7th, July 6th, August 3rd, September 9th in 1925. And her attendance continues like that all the way through the end, really, of 1926. But we also have members that don't have good attendance. Mrs. Baird, for example. If you look up a little bit further...
I hope her descendants aren't watching.
They might be. They're actually still members of my church.
They are.
Yes.
Oh, this is your church record. Yes, that's
absolutely.
right. Yes.
Yeah. And this person's granddaughter, I believe, is very much present and active in my church. Ironically, she's our current record keeper.
Oh, my word.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. But Mrs. Baird, in that same time period, from 1925 to 1926, only had 4 records of appearance on the official rolls. One was on May 4th, 1925, then next on September 9th, 1925, then again on June 7th, 1925, and September 9th, 1925. So very sporadic.
Right. Now, these are kept very well. The minister will look at these attendance records.
Yes, it was a requirement to be a member in good standing that you had a certain degree of attendance, especially on these important days.
I see. Were people ever dismissed from the church for poor attendance?
Yes, and it's still part of our official law and doctrine that if people are not active and engaged in our church, that they will be removed from our rolls after a 2-year period. They're given a warning over 2 years, and they're called what we call a warning. So they're no longer members in good standing, but they are still members. But after 2 years, they will be stricken from our rolls if they don't improve their attendance or involvement in the life of the church.
I see. Now, Pastor Matt, when we have exhausted we go right to the source, right to the Methodist Church where the birth, marriage, death took place, or the attendance record. If a church no longer exists, if it has closed, what is the next step for the researcher? Where do you have to go? Where are records put? You had mentioned something about a conference. What can you define that for me?
Yeah, so the term annual conference has 2 definitions in the Methodist Church, but one is the regional body of the church, and that's where the bishop presides and where the bishop's home is, the episcopal office of the church.
Right.
For New Jersey, for example, it's in Neptune, New Jersey, and there's a big building there, and that's where if a church closes, most of the records will end up there and archived right there in that building.
But you have to identify the conference. Is that correct?
Yes, and there's a lot of different conferences. It's a regional body of a church. And in the Greater New Jersey Annual Conference, there's about 550 churches that are under the authority of that conference office.
So if you know where your ancestor worshiped, you have to find the corresponding conference. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. And we do have a website, which we're going to put up right now, GCAH, and what does that stand for?
That's the General Commission on Archives and History, and so that is kind of the global Methodist Church, and so that will be the next step up from the conference. The United Methodist Church is a global body, and so we have a few different archival offices, but that is the main body that you would go to. But
you could use that as a source to find where a conference is.
Absolutely,
right,
yes.
Okay. And then we have the umchistory.org, and that's
the official website for our Methodist history, and it has all sorts of information. It's searchable, it's user-friendly, and just has a ton of information about Methodist history, largely from the pastor side and the history of the spreading movement, but you might be able to find some information about individual members.
Right. Now, right here in New Jersey, we do have the Methodist Archives at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. And I'm sure you've been there many times.
Yes, it's a beautiful facility.
And they do have a wonderful research facility there, but they have mostly records of Methodist clergy. This is what they have told me. So if your ancestor was a Methodist minister, you can use that resource. Is that correct?
Yes, there's all sorts of archives there. A lot of it is just records, but they also have a fantastic display of physical items from the early church.
Very good. And now other sources that we can talk about are printed histories. Many churches will have a printed history, and Pastor Matt, he has his right here, Basking Ridge Methodism of the Bishop Janes Methodist Church. Now, it was once called Methodist Episcopal many years ago. Is that correct?
Yes. The Methodist movement has had several names over the years. It officially became a denomination when it separated from the Anglican Church in the late 1700s.
Right.
John Wesley was opposed to separation, but after the Revolutionary War, he authorized the separation. So we've undergone many names for the late 1700s till almost 1950s, it was the Methodist Episcopal Church.
Right, very good. And now, in the 50s, you said it's now the UMC.
That's correct. It was a merger of the Methodist Episcopal Church and the United Brethren Church. So you see the names came together also.
Right. So these printed histories of individual churches are very good. And we have another one of a church in Meadowview, Virginia, a very old one there as well. And of course, the Mormons have done microfilming all the time. And of course, here's a source that you know about, the Family Bible, of course. The Methodists kept the Family Bible, and they kept all the information in there. Okay. Before we close, there is something else that's very unique in Methodism, camp meetings. Can you define that for our viewers?
Yeah, so a lot of people know about the concept of revival. And the camp meeting was, in the late 1800s, one of the biggest movements that we had to spread the Methodist movement really across the frontier. People would gather and have these wonderful, wonderful celebrations, a week, 2 weeks, sometimes even a month long, that were just these wonderful celebrations of faith and life. Bringing it to the frontier and sharing this Methodist tradition.
And these were usually held in the summer, is that correct? Or
yes, because they were outdoors and people came in tents and would set them up.
Right. I know they would pitch a tent, an actual tent. And right here in New Jersey, we have two surviving camp meetings, one in Morris County and Mount Tabor, New Jersey, which isn't far from where we are right now. That's an early surviving camp meeting. And one by the seashore in Ocean Grove, Monmouth County, where you have been. And they still have a camp meeting every summer there. Is that one of the last surviving ones? Or
yes, there's not very many left anymore, but it's a wonderful facility with a huge organ. Even though it's an outdoor facility, there's a massive organ there, and you can see just how important this meeting was there.
Right, right. Okay, so getting back to research, go right to the church. And we hope and pray the records are still there. If they are not there, then go to the
conference office.
All right, and they will have an archivist there that will help you, or?
Yes, they can point you in the right direction, and hopefully they will have some records. They may or may not, depending on what happened when that individual church closed.
Right. Now, you had records in your church that went way back at one time. Do you know where those early records are now?
We don't. Our church building is now in its third rendition, and when the most recent rendition was built in the 1920s, most of the records disappeared at that point. So they might have gone to a conference office, they might have gone to the general custodian, but we no longer have records from before about 1925 at my local church.
Right, okay. Well, this has been a wonderful interview with Pastor Mathew Enzler of the Bishop Janes United Methodist Church in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. I do want to thank you very much, Pastor, for coming on my show. I guess we have to do one of these nowadays. And I do want to thank you people out there for watching my show on Methodist Church Records. And on that note, as I say all the time, we are all descendants of ancient civilizations. Genealogy is your key to the history of your family. And so until next time, this is Stephen Conte wishing you the very best of luck in your research, and above all, happy ancestor hunting. Good night.